The sexton had not expected company on so grey a morning, and he said so, his spade pausing in the soft earth of the churchyard at Ashwell. He said it to the woman kneeling at the stone nearest the yew hedge. The woman with bare hands pressed flat against the lettering, as though she might warm it, as though the November cold had gotten into the inscription itself and needed drawing out. He observed that she came every Thursday, and that she had done so for the better part of 8 months, which was longer than the stone had stood, since the stone had stood only since March. He observed these things aloud to no one in particular, because the woman did not answer him, and the churchyard offered no other audience, and then he went back to his work on the far side of the church wall. Dorothea Penrose did not hear the sexton. She heard the wind in the yew and the sound of her own breathing, and nothing else. The name carved into the limestone was Ashford, and beneath it a given name that was not hers, and beneath that a date she could not look at directly, and beneath that the Latin inscription her mother had chosen from the vicar's list because it was short and cost nothing extra. She had stood over the stonemason's shoulder as he chiseled the letters in February, and she had counted what each word cost, and she had chosen fewer words because fewer words meant fewer pence, and she had been ashamed of the counting even as she did it, and she was still ashamed. She pressed her palms against the cold stone until the cold moved up through her wrists and into her arms, and she thought, as she thought every Thursday, that it was not enough. That a stone in a churchyard in a village no one visited was not enough for a man of 32 who had been alive and present in every room he entered. It was not nearly enough. She did not hear the horse until it had already stopped. She heard the creak of leather, the muffled strike of boots on frozen ground. She heard a particular silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had displaced it, the way a large stone dropped into still water displaces everything around it without a sound of its own. She kept her eyes on the inscription. She did not move. She told herself she was simply gathering herself before rising, that she had been kneeling too long, and her knees required a moment of preparation, and this was almost true. When she finally turned, there was a man standing at the iron gate, one hand resting on the latch, and he was looking at the headstone behind her with an expression she had no name for, an expression she could not read in the flat November light, because it contained too many things at once, some of which could not coexist. And yet there they all were in his face, unresolved, refusing to simplify themselves for her convenience. He was tall and dressed for hard travel, his greatcoat dark with rain that had dried unevenly across the shoulders, his cravat knotted without elegance. He had dark hair that the wind had disordered, and a jaw that the last several months had done nothing to soften, and eyes the color of pewter in overcast sky, fixed on the name in the stone. She knew then. She knew before he opened the gate. He said, "That is my name." She said, "Yes." Neither of them moved for a long moment, and the yew hedge stirred in the wind. And somewhere over the church, the rooks called to each other in their hoarse, indifferent voices. Rupert Ashford had left England in early February of the previous year, before the thaw, before anyone had thought to ask him directly whether he intended to return. He had left under circumstances that the county of Devonshire had spent the better part of 7 months reconstructing from available evidence, which is to say from a combination of fact, inference, and invention, the proportions of which varied by household. The facts were these. His father, Edmund Ashford of Whitmore Park, had died in October of 1816, suddenly, in his library, the cause described by the physician as an episode of the heart. The inheritance had passed to the eldest son, Rupert, who had been residing in Hampshire at the time and had come north immediately. He had remained through the winter, managing the estate, settling accounts, receiving the condolences of neighbors who had known his father and now wished to know him. He had been described by those who encountered him in those weeks as contained, which was the polite word for what several of them privately considered alarming. He spoke when spoken to. He attended to business with meticulous attention. He did not appear to grieve, which was remarked upon, though not to his face, because he was now the master of Whitmore Park, and Whitmore Park was the largest estate in the district. And one is careful about what one remarks upon to the masters of large estates. What no one remarked upon, because no one knew, was that Rupert had spent the majority of those winter evenings in his father's library, reading his father's papers, and had discovered there that his father had been, for the better part of 4 years, quietly and methodically spending money he did not have. Not lavishly. Not in ways that would have attracted notice. Simply spending slightly more than the estate produced, drawing on credit extended by a London merchant house in anticipation of income that had not materialized, until the total had become a figure that Rupert had sat with for 3 days before he could look at it steadily. His father's solicitor, a man named Hartwell, had been managing the arrangement with discretion and had written to Rupert in February with the clear-eyed assessment that the debt required settlement before June, or the lower fields and the east cottages would be forfeited in satisfaction of the terms. Rupert had connections in Lyons. He had a friend from his years in the army, a man named Corbett, who had married a French merchant's daughter and understood the movement of commercial credit across the Channel. The arrangement had taken 7 months rather than 3, because Corbett's father-in-law drove a careful bargain, and because Rupert was not a man who accepted unfavorable terms simply because he was in difficulty. He had returned with the debt settled and a small residue, and he had returned via London, where he had made additional inquiries. And he had ridden directly to Ashwell, because Ashwell was where the estate was, and the estate was where the letters had been sent from, and the letters had been sent by a Miss Penrose, and Rupert had read those letters so many times that he could have reproduced sections of them from memory, which was not a fact he had told anyone, including himself, until the morning he rode out of London. The inference was this. Something had passed between Rupert Ashford and his younger brother, Gerald, in the weeks before his departure. Something sufficiently serious to have sent one of them to the continent and left the other in possession of the park without formal authority to manage it. Gerald Ashford was not the heir. He had no legal standing in the matter. The solicitor in Taunton, a Mr. Fitch, had apparently spent several weeks attempting to clarify the situation by correspondence, with limited success, because Gerald's response to correspondence was warm and friendly, and entirely without specific commitments. Gerald had charm in the way of men who have never needed anything else, and have therefore not developed anything else, and he had managed the park for 7 months with charm and no competence, and several repairs had been deferred, and the tenants in the east cottages had been patient, and the lower field drainage was not yet fixed. Dorothea had known Edmund Ashford because her father had known him, the way 2 men of adjacent estates know each other, which is to say, well enough for courtesy, and not well enough for candor. When Edmund died, her father, already unwell, had attended the funeral in the rain, and had himself taken ill the following week, and had died in March, which was why the stone in the churchyard had stood only since March. The inscription was short because there was not money to spare for more Latin. Her father had been a man of education and careful habits, and a modest competence that had seemed, throughout her childhood, entirely sufficient, and had proved, at his death, to have been quietly insufficient for several years, a fact he had managed with such scrupulous discretion that even she had not known. She had known only that they were comfortable. They were not comfortable. They had been borrowing against the competents for 4 years, and the creditors were polite and patient in the way of men who know the law will eventually deliver what courtesy cannot. And she was 24 years old, and the daughter of a man who had died owing money he could not repay, and the village of Ashwell had decided what that made her, and said so in the careful indirect way of people who wish to wound without being caught at it. She was the sad Penrose girl, the one without prospects, the one whose father had left her nothing but a rented cottage and a name that no longer attached to anything solid. She had heard this first from Mrs. Grantley of the village at the Ashwells' autumn supper in late October, said to a companion with the particular pleasure of a woman who has always been comfortable and believes comfort to be a species of virtue. She had stood 3 feet away holding a glass of Madeira she had not drunk, and heard herself described as a very sad case. Very sad indeed. And the companion had murmured agreement. And Mrs. Grantley had said that of course the Penroses had always overreached, the father included. And one could only hope the girl was sensible enough to find a situation before the creditors grew impatient. She had set down the Madeira and gone home through the dark and sat with the fire until it went out. Not from grief, but from a particular cold fury that had no object available to receive it. She was not, as it happened, without resources. She had her mother's teaching, which had been thorough. She had a clear hand and an accurate memory, and the ability to keep accounts without error, which was how she had come to arrange, through Mr. Fitch, to serve as informal correspondent for the Ashford estate during the months of Gerald's unauthorized tenure. Gerald was affable and charming, and not particularly interested in letters, and Mr. Fitch had required someone literate to manage the household correspondence until the matter of the inheritance was properly resolved. Dorothea had taken the work without adverting to the indignity of it, because dignity was a luxury, and the creditors were not. She had done the work with the same precision she brought to everything, and she had not told Mrs. Grantley about it. And Mrs. Grantley had found out anyway, and had told several people that it was a very sad case when a gentleman's daughter was reduced to acting as a sort of secretary, and the shame of it might have been worse if Dorothea had spent more time attending to what Mrs. Grantley said. She had written to him 3 times, once in April, once in June, once in September. The April letter had requested guidance on a matter of tenant repair, and had been 3 pages long, and had contained, in the margins, a complete inventory of deferred maintenance that she had compiled from the estate records without being asked to do so, because it seemed wasteful not to note what she had found. The June letter had reported a flooding in the lower field, and had asked whether Mr. Gerald had authority to commission the drainage work at the estate's expense, and it had also contained, in careful language, a summary of what she observed was Gerald's approach to correspondence, which was to say that Gerald did not answer letters that required decisions. The September letter had contained a financial summary and a request, phrased in language so neutral and precise that she herself had been unable to determine, rereading it, whether it was a request or a statement of fact. It was the most carefully constructed sentence she had ever written, and it had said, in effect, "The situation requires your presence." And she had not said this plainly because she had not the right to say it plainly. And she had not said it indirectly because that would have been dishonest. And she had threaded between these 2 impossibilities for an hour before settling on phrasing that was honest and precise and entirely undemanding. None of the letters had received a reply. She rose from her knees at the gravestone. The cold had moved from her wrists to her shoulders, and her skirts were damp at the hem where they had rested on the frozen ground, and she was very aware of the iron gate and the man standing at it, who had still not moved. "You did not receive my letters," she said. It was not a question. "I received them," he said. A pause settled between them, weighted with what this admitted. She smoothed her skirts. She did not look at the stone again. "Then you chose not to reply." "I did." She looked at him directly. He had not moved from the gate, and he had stopped looking at the headstone and was looking at her now. And the expression in his face had shifted to something that was less complicated and more uncomfortable. The look of a man who has prepared himself for an encounter and finds that the encounter is not what he prepared for. She had no idea what he had prepared for. She had no idea what she was. "The lower field drainage was commissioned in July," she said. "The tenants in the east cottages have been waiting since May for the repair to the far roof. I wrote to your brother in August about the matter, and he told me it would be attended to. It has not been attended to. Mr. Fitch will be able to give you a full account." She pulled on her gloves. The right first, then the left, the leather cold and slightly stiff. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford." She walked past the gate he was still holding open, past him, along the path toward the village lane. She did not run. She had enough dignity left for that. She did not hear him follow. She heard the gate close and the sound of his horse shifting its weight on the frozen ground, and then nothing, and she kept walking, and her heart was considerably less composed than her face. It was Mrs. Grantley who informed Dorothea the following morning that Mr. Ashford had taken possession of Whitmore Park the previous afternoon and had sent Gerald packing by dinner, which was told as though it were a humiliation Gerald deserved. Though Mrs. Grantley had been praising Gerald's pleasant manners for the better part of 8 months and had attended 2 of his suppers with apparent enjoyment. She said these things through the door of the lending library, where Dorothea was returning 2 volumes she had borrowed, and she said them in the particular tone of a woman who wishes to be the source of information rather than its recipient. She added, as Dorothea turned to leave, "He will want to put the park in order, of course, now that he is back. I imagine he will have no need of informal arrangements." She said informal with the care of someone choosing a word that means more than it says. Her companion, a Mrs. Alcott, who had known the Penroses since Dorothea was small, looked briefly at the floor. Dorothea said that she was certain Mr. Ashford would manage everything admirably, and walked home and sat at the table with her account book open to the figures for September, and considered what she was going to do about the creditors who were patient and polite, and had been both for long enough. He came to the cottage on the 3rd day. She was in the small garden at the back, cutting the last of the autumn kale, her old mantle pulled close against the morning cold, her hair not yet dressed for the day because there was no one to dress it for. She heard the creak of the garden gate, and when she looked up, he was standing at it, still in traveling clothes, or perhaps new traveling clothes that looked like the old ones, his hat under his arm, his face doing the complicated thing again in the gray morning light. She straightened. She held the kale in both hands without quite knowing she was doing it. "Miss Penrose," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She waited. He came through the gate. He stopped at a distance that was correct by every standard of propriety, and yet felt, in the small compass of the winter garden, considerably closer than the distance actually was. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "Mr. Fitch engaged me. The arrangement was always informal, as Mrs. Grantley has kindly reminded me. That is not what I am accounting for." He did not look away. She had expected him to look away. the way men did when they owed explanations they did not intend to give. He did not. He looked at her steadily, and the locked quality she had seen at the churchyard had begun to shift, though she could not have said toward what, and the distance between them was not wide enough to dismiss whatever it was shifting toward. "My father's solicitor," he said at last, "wrote to me in February. Not Mr. Fitch. My father's solicitor in London, a man named Hartwell, who had been managing a private matter for my father for several years, without my knowledge." He paused. The private matter was a debt. She stood very still. "My father borrowed against the estate in 1812, he said. Against the estate, and against certain expectations of income that did not materialize. The amount was considerable. Hartwell wrote to inform me that the terms of the debt required settlement by June of 1817, and that if settlement was not made, the creditor had standing to attach the lower fields and the east cottages in satisfaction." He looked at her. "I went to the continent because I had a debt that could not be settled by remaining in England, and I had connections in Lyons that Hartwell believed could be arranged to advantage. It took longer than I anticipated." He paused again. "I did not write, because I did not know what to say, and I am not accustomed to not knowing." She looked at the kale in her hands. She had been gripping it too tightly, and the leaves had marked her palms, a cold green impression of effort. "The debt is settled," he said. "I am glad," she said, and meant it entirely, though she was also aware that she was standing in a winter garden with unwashed hair and cold hands, and that this was not how she would have chosen to receive news of any kind. She had not thought he could surprise her further. "I also made inquiries," he said, "while I was in London, regarding a debt held against a property in Ashwell. A debt contracted by a Mr. George Penrose, against a modest competence and an annual income that had been insufficient for some years." He said it plainly, without inflection, and watched her face. "I settled it." The garden went very quiet. A wren moved in the hedge, rustling 3 dry leaves, and then was still. "You had no right," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a small miracle given that her hands were not, the kale trembling slightly where she held it. "No," he said. "I had no right." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hedge behind her, at the winter stalks of what had been the kitchen garden, at the pale sky above the cottage roof. Then he looked at her again, and the look had something in it that she felt in the base of her throat, that she felt in the particular way one feels things that have no rational name, things the body knows before the mind permits. "Because your father attended my father's funeral in November and took ill and died in March, and left you nothing that should have been enough. And you came every Thursday to a stone that was not adequate to him, and you pressed your hands against it in the cold as though you could make it adequate by the force of attention." He paused. "I watched you for some time before you turned." The kale was quite still in her hands now, because she had stopped breathing. If you have ever loved a story told this slowly, this carefully, stay with it. What comes next is the thing she did not allow herself to expect. He had stood at the gate for 6 minutes before she turned. He had stood there long enough to know that this woman came every Thursday, and did so not from duty, but from something that refused to diminish, and that she pressed her hands against cold stone the way people press their hands against the things they cannot hold. He had stood there long enough to understand something about himself that the months in Lyons had been organizing toward a conclusion without his consent. He was not, by temperament, a man who arrived at conclusions he had not planned to reach. This one had arrived anyway. "Miss Penrose," he said. And then he stopped, because he had prepared a sentence, and the sentence was inadequate. He looked at her hands on the kale, the cold marks on her palms, the slight trembling that was not from cold. He said, instead of the sentence, "I want you to stay." She looked up at him. "Not at the cottage," he said. And then he was quiet again, because even he could hear how insufficient that was, how much it left unnamed. He had come to this garden prepared to speak plainly, and plainness was failing him, which was an entirely new experience, and not one he found comfortable. He was a man who had negotiated commercial credit across the Channel, who had managed the affairs of a large estate while carrying news he had not sought. He was not accustomed to words that would not assemble properly. "What I mean," he said at last, "is that I have had 7 months to understand what I should have understood before I left, and that I am aware I have no particular right to speak to you this way, and that I am going to speak to you this way regardless, because the alternative is to say nothing, and I have already tried saying nothing and found it insufficient." He paused. "I would like you to consider whether you might find Whitmore Park a tolerable situation." She was looking at him with an expression he could not read, which was unusual. He was generally able to read faces. "As what?" she said. He said, "As its mistress." The garden was absolutely silent. The November sky sat low and gray over the cottage roof. And somewhere beyond the hedge a cart was passing along the lane, the far wheel loose against the iron ruts. And neither of them moved until the cart had passed entirely, and the silence returned, complete and cold and full of things neither of them had yet said. She said, "You have known me 3 days. I have known of you for 8 months, he said. I have read your letters for 8 months. Your April letter is 3 pages and contains an inquiry about a tenant roof that is also, if you read it with attention, a complete audit of the estate's deferred maintenance for the preceding 2 years. You wrote it in the margin rather than the body so as not to presume. Your June letter describes a flooding event with a precision that suggests you had already investigated the drainage and formed a view before you were asked to. Your September letter contains a request that I return, phrased with such care to avoid the appearance of presumption that it took me 3 readings to understand. It was also an appeal." He paused. "I have read those letters a great many times." She swallowed. The kale in her hands was crushed by now, past any salvaging. "You did not reply," she said. "No. I am asking you to forgive me that." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the way he held himself, very still, in the way of men who are containing something they will not loose without permission. She thought about 3 letters sent into silence. She thought about every Thursday at the stone, the cold rising through her palms, the insufficient inscription. She thought about Mrs. Grantley and the word informal said with such precision. She thought about her father keeping bees in the back garden and reading Pindar on autumn afternoons, while the creditors were quietly accumulating, and the man standing before her now who had read about her father's debt and ridden to London before riding here, and who was looking at her from behind pewter-colored eyes that were not cold. She understood that now, had never been cold, but were instead the eyes of a man who guarded his interior with considerable care, because what was inside it was not nothing. "What happened to the stone?" she said. He was still for a moment. "It is not adequate," she said. He was a man who could read Greek and who kept bees in his back garden and who knew every tenant on his property by name, and the stone says none of that. "No," he said. He deserved a better stone. "Yes. I cannot afford one." He looked at her carefully. "I can." It was a small thing to offer. It was not exactly small. She understood what it meant to be offered a thing by someone who has read your letters 8 months, and come to a winter garden to say something he could not quite say, and who, failing to say the larger thing adequately, had said instead a smaller true thing that pointed in the same direction. She looked down at the ruined kale. She had gripped it through the whole of a conversation that had rearranged several of her certainties, and it was past saving, and she found that she did not particularly mind. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should go away and come back tomorrow, and we should begin again from the beginning. Because I am not properly dressed for any of this, and you have told me things I need to sit with, and you are looking at me in a way that makes it very difficult to think." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, exactly, but the precursor to one. "That is the most sensible proposition I have heard this morning," he said. "You said very little," she said. "Most of it was me." "Yes," he said. "You will find I am not much given to speech when there are other things to attend to." He left through the garden gate, latching it behind him with the same care he had latched the churchyard gate, the care of a man who closes things properly because he intends to open them again. She stood in the garden until she heard his horse on the lane, and then she stood there a little longer, the cold around her, the gray sky absolute overhead. She was still holding the kale. He came back the following afternoon as promised, and the afternoon after that, and on the third afternoon he brought Mr. Fitch, which was either very practical or entirely unromantic depending on one's disposition, and Dorothea had decided somewhere in the intervening days that she was disposed to consider it practical. On the second afternoon, they had walked in the winter garden together, which was not warm and not pretty, but was the garden she had, and he had asked her about her father's bees. Not as a courtesy, but with the particular attention of a man who wishes to form a true picture. And she had told him about them, about the 3 hives her father had kept along the south wall, and the honey that tasted of summer clover, and how after her father's death she had covered them for the winter in the traditional way, and had not uncovered them in spring, because she could not quite, and they had died. He had listened without comment, which was better than comment would have been. On the third afternoon, Mr. Fitch produced a document on the writing table in the cottage's small sitting room, and Dorothea read it herself before she asked Rupert to read it aloud, not because she could not read it, but because she wanted to hear it in his voice, and he read it in the level, unhurried way he had of speaking. And when he had finished, he folded it and set it on the table between them. He looked at her. She was aware of his hands on the table, large and still, the hands of a man who had spent the autumn managing commercial credit, and the summer before that managing an estate, and the winter before that holding his father's affairs together by the force of careful attention, and who was now holding himself very still in a small sitting room in a cottage in Ashwell, waiting. She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dorothea." Her given name, in his voice, was a thing she had not heard before, and she understood why he had saved it, because it cost something to say it. She could hear what it cost him, and the cost was the point. It was precisely the point. It was what the letters and the silence and the settled debt and the better stone had all been moving toward without declaring themselves, and hearing her name in his voice was the declaration she had not known to wait for. She gave him her hand. He held it in both of his, her cold, bare hand, and he looked at it for a moment as though it were a thing of considerable interest, and then he turned it and pressed his lips very lightly to the inside of her wrist where the pulse was, and she felt the warmth travel from that point up through her arm to her throat and into the place behind her eyes, and Mr. Fitch appeared to be examining the ceiling with great concentration. "The stone," Rupert said, still holding her hand. "The stone," she agreed. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the fire in the cottage's small grate threw warm light between them. and she was aware of the sound of her own pulse in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The stone was replaced before Christmas, with the vicar's assistance and a mason brought from Taunton, and the new inscription was longer and contained a line from the Greek that her father had been fond of, a line about the particular quality of light on things that do not last, and it cost considerably more than the Latin. Rupert paid for it without discussion, because it was not a discussion. Dorothea stood at the churchyard on the first Thursday after it was set, and pressed her palms against it, as she always did. And the new lettering was crisper under her fingers, the edges still clean and sharp. She did not stay as long as she usually did. She had somewhere to be. The wedding was held in the same churchyard in the second week of January, with only the vicar and Mr. Fitch and the Penroses' old housekeeper, a small woman named Tabitha, who had stayed on out of loyalty when there was nothing left to pay her with, and who cried through the entire short service with a magnificence that did not pause for breath. Rupert had wanted a larger occasion, at the park, with neighbors. Dorothea had not. She had wanted the churchyard, and the two stones, and the vicar's plain words, and the cold, because the cold was honest, and the churchyard was the only place in Ashwell that knew the whole of her, and did not require her to be other than she was. He had deferred, without argument, which she registered as a piece of information she would carry forward with care. She registered it through the pressure of his gloved hand on her fingers at the vicar's instruction, the formal grip of a man who understood that the ceremony was the thing and that everything else was afterward. She registered it in the sound of her new name spoken aloud by the vicar, and in the small catch of her own breath when she heard it, and in the way Rupert turned to look at her when the vicar pronounced them. Not at the vicar, and not at the small assembly, but at her. A look that had nothing in it of the November pewter. A look that was simply direct and present and hers. Tabitha, behind them, was no longer silent. The rooks circled the church tower in the cold air and said nothing, as rooks always do, and the sky was white with the promise of snow. Whitmore Park was cold when they arrived, as large houses are cold when they have been managed without proper attention, the fires not yet drawing well in the east wing, the corridors holding the particular chill of stone and plaster that takes weeks of habitation to dispel. Gerald had left the house in a condition of cheerful incompleteness, several fires laid but not lit, a dinner half planned, the good china still somewhere in transit from where Gerald had been using it for shooting party breakfasts. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Bray who had served the Ashfords for 20 years and had spent 7 months biting her tongue in Gerald's vicinity, stood in the entrance hall and gave Dorothea a look of such unguarded relief that Dorothea nearly laughed. She did not laugh. She said, "Good evening, Mrs. Bray. Shall we begin with the fires?" Rupert spoke quietly with Mrs. Bray about the immediate arrangements, and Dorothea walked through the rooms while they spoke, moving through doorways, noting the proportions, the quality of light from the tall windows, the arrangement of furniture that had accumulated through his father's years at the park, and had the look of furniture that has been placed with care, rather than simply deposited. She stopped in the library, because the library was the warmest room, 2 fires lit against the January cold, and the shelves were floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the volumes old and well-worn and smelling of leather and the particular dust of reading, the smell of a room that has been used by someone who loved it. She ran her finger along a row of spines, slowly, not reading the titles, simply feeling the texture of them. Old calfskin, worn cloth, 1 volume rebound badly in a later period with a slightly different color that did not quite match its neighbors. She pulled this one out. The spine said Hesiod. She opened it. A man's notes in the margins, cramped and energetic. Notes from a man who had engaged with what he read, who had objected to certain translations and recorded his objections in a small, forceful hand, who had drawn a small arrow beside a passage he considered important and written underneath it the word yes. She heard Rupert in the doorway before she turned. "My father read Greek," he said. He came into the room, past the first fire, and stopped near the shelves where she was standing. "His notes are in the margins." She turned the volume in her hands. The note beside the arrow said yes, and beneath that, in smaller letters, as though added on a later reading, still yes. "He would have liked yours," she said. "My father. Your father." She looked up. They would have had a great deal to say to each other. He looked at the volume in her hands, and then at her, and the fire behind him threw light across the side of his face. And she saw what was in his face at that moment, the thing that was not grief, and was not relief, and was not simply gladness, but contained all of those things in the proportion that only time and cost can mix them. He had been gone 7 months, and he had carried something through those months, and the carrying was over, and the being over showed in his face, and he did not mind that it showed, because they were alone in his library on the first evening of a January that was going to be different from every January either of them had known before it. She set the volume on the shelf. She stepped toward him, and he did not move, because he was a man who knew when not to move, and when she was close enough, she put her hand against his jaw, her palm against the line of it, cold fingers against warm skin, and he covered her hand with his and held it there. And they stood in the library of Whitmore Park with the fires burning down on either side of them, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said. That was not already being said in the weight of his hand over hers, and the warmth of the room around them, and the 2 fires burning, and the books on 3 walls, and the small marginal word, yes. The snow began before midnight. She heard it first as a change in the quality of the silence outside the library windows, a particular hush that English winter evenings acquire when snow is settling, as though the ground itself were holding its breath to receive something. She went to the window and looked out at the garden of Whitmore Park, white now under the first January snow, the paths invisible, the formal hedges gentled into soft shapes, the entire visible world reduced to what was still and quiet and present. Rupert came to stand beside her at the window. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air near the glass, and they looked out at the garden together, and she thought about the churchyard, which was under the same snow, and the 2 stones, the old one and the new, both carrying their names into the white night with equal patience, the inadequate inscription, and the longer one, the one that said enough. She thought that this was what enough looked like. She looked for a long moment at the snow, and then she looked at his face, the profile of it, the jaw she had placed her hand against, the face that had been unreadable to her in the gray November light of the churchyard, and was unreadable to her still in certain lights, but was less unreadable than it had been, and would be, she suspected, less unreadable still. She suspected this because she had read his letters too, in a sense, the letters that were not letters, the 7 months of silence that had been, she now understood, a man trying to say something he did not yet have the words for, and finding the words only when he was standing at an iron gate in November, with his name in stone behind him, and an unknown woman's palms pressed flat against the cold. If you have stayed until this last quiet window, know that Dorothea kept every Thursday, even in the years that came after, even in the years that were full enough to justify forgetting. She never forgot. She simply brought company. In time, small and warm, and interested in the rooks. The stone in the churchyard with the longer inscription stood for many years in the same place, and the lettering remained legible, and the word yes in his father's margin remained, under Hesiod's observation about light, precisely as he had written it. Still, yes.